Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
The Soul of the Stranger is the first book-length Jewish work of trans theology. So theology that is starting from trans experience and rooted in trans and transgender concerns, whatever those may be. When I first wrote about the Akedah, it was in a poem that began, "I cannot tell if I'm the father or the son." And the perspective that I brought to it, obviously I was still hiding my trans identity. So this was submerged. And I was young, so I'm not sure how fully conscious I was of this. But I was writing about gender as a form of binding. Akedah means binding, and in that poem, that's what binds the father and the son into this kind of violence and freezes both of them eternally into that kind of position. I think I was struck by that, with that also because of the lack of bodies and physical description. And some years later, when I read Eric Auerbach's essay in Mimesis, comparing the Akedah with part of the Odyssey, he points out the absence of description and the absence of detail. And he takes it in a different direction. He says that this is necessary for two things. One is in the Torah, people are not described sufficiently to lock them into a predictable character the way that you do in the Odyssey. So that means the Torah tells stories in a way that creates possibility and freedom and uncertainty about free will, the kind of idea of character that's necessary for someone like Abraham to enter into a covenant with God, despite the lack of any social reasons to do that. The other thing he said is that by cutting out the detail, God moves into the foreground. God is always at a disadvantage because God has no descriptors. There's nothing to say about what God looks like or sounds like or anything like that. But paring down the descriptors that would go into a normal human narrative means that this sense of God is much more present there. And when I looked at that story explicitly from a trans perspective for the Soul of the Stranger, I was combining both of those things in terms of my understanding. I was specifically interested in it as a form of what I call trans experience, which is kinds of human experience that involve problems with fitting human categories like gender, specifically gender, but which aren't limited to transgender people. And in that story, obviously, starting at the end, this is kind of a disastrous example of being a male. I mean, Isaac at that point has sort of fallen into the role of firstborn male, the inheritor of the blessing and everything. And it's specifically because of this gender identity that's pushed onto him that he ends up being tied to an altar with his father holding a knife over him. So that early sense of the violence of the male gender and being bound into it, at this point I'm looking at it and I'm like, wow, Isaac is the least trans character, I think, in the entire Torah. Isaac is, whenever we're shown a glimpse of him, he is trying to conform. He says very little. He never steps out of line. Tradition portrays him as an inheritor rather than an innovator. He even takes his new bride into his mother's tent, clearly hadn't read Freud at that point. But so he seems like he is doing everything he can to disappear into the male role that he's assigned at birth and to do what everyone expects. And it still ends up, that very fact ends up with him targeted for violence by God. And at first I thought that, well, this, if you're determined to live in utter conformity with your assigned role, no matter what it costs you, you have no trans experience. But then I thought, actually, he's living out of a terrible form of trans experience, the nightmare of gender, because trans people know what a nightmare it can be to, and what kinds of violent attention can be focused on you because of the gender role that you're assigned at birth. For trans people, that's often because we don't fit that role or we're violating it, but not always. In some families, the nightmare is just you're trying to conform. You're trying to submerge your trans identity, but the terms of the gender role you're given are so horrific. You're assigned female at birth, and the model is, your mom's abused by your dad, and that's the model of what it is to be a woman, and you're supposed to inherit it. And then I realized, actually, there's so many examples of non-trans people where trying to be what we're told we're supposed to be because of our gender exposes us to violence and even gets us killed. The boys who say, well, sure, it's the Vietnam War and people are dying over there, but that's what men in my family do. So that's what I have to do. The abused women who say, like, okay, so he's hitting me, but it's the role of a wife to suffer and endure it. I'm being good in the way that gender tells me I have to be good. And so when I realized that and I came back to the story of Isaac, I saw this as somebody he's almost like a gender sleepwalker. He moves from being the second-born son to the firstborn son, not like what his child Jacob does by supplanting Esau. He doesn't do anything. His father and mother work it out for him, and it's like, okay, son, we've got rid of the actual firstborn. Now you're the firstborn son. And he's kind of sleepwalking along, and then God says, oh, yeah, your firstborn son, I have a little test for you. I'm going to see if you're willing to sacrifice your firstborn son. And so, again, without any volition on his part, he winds up being targeted for violence. And the story itself is told, from chronologically, he should be a grown man of about 37 years old, if I'm not mistaken. But commentators have long observed that he sounds like a small child. He goes along with his father almost unquestioningly. His father assumes that he's going to do that and even makes him carry the wood for his own burnt offering, which I think is horrific in a way that I honestly can't even contemplate. The only time we hear his voice, he's like, here's the fire and the knife, but where's the ram for the burnt offering? And otherwise, he's silent. He's silent when his father builds the altar. He's silent when he's tied on the altar. He's silent when his father lifts the knife. And he is silent afterward. And he never talks to Abraham again, as near as we can tell. And in fact, he never talks to God again either. It's like he is deeply traumatized by insisting that he is going to live this male role to the death. But the only trace of it is that he loses his voice completely. And then when I thought about my own determination to keep living as a man until I was dead, and even after it was clear that it was killing me, I thought, I have always kind of looked down on Isaac as the least interesting and most passive of the patriarchs. And now I'm getting it. Now I'm realizing that he was just taking more and more damage. But he was determined to be faithful even to a system of gender that was going to kill him. There is a lot of horror in the Torah. And I feel sick every time I read this story. And I'm always grateful for it in a way. For one thing, There is violence in families. That's not, I think, the way God or the Torah see that story, as being about violence in families. But it ensures that Jews can never lull ourselves with this idea that, oh, we have these idyllic families where nothing terrible ever happens and parents are always good parents. So the Torah has a way of insisting on highlighting aspects of human experience without sugarcoating, without. The thing that's horrifying about that story is not just the violence. You can see that in the Iliad also. There's a sacrifice of a child for instrumental purposes. But it's because there's no real rationale for it. You know, the Torah never makes it, he doesn't end up being sacrificed, but if he had, that was, after all, what God says to do. And so I respect it. I'm grateful for it, partly because of the fact of violence in families, but also because I feel like it wants us to realize that there's a certain degree of, we have to be ready. If we're going to hang out with a God who is not human, we have to be ready for the violence that grows out of that kind of relationship also. My favorite commentary on the Akedah is, it's not one of the ones that trumpets Abraham's faithfulness, as you might imagine. And it's not even the strange ones in the Middle Ages when the Ashkenazi Jews were being subjected to such horrific pogroms. They kept imagining Isaac being resurrected, clearly being the strange resonance with the Christians who were killing them. My favorite one is the commentary that says God was disappointed with Abraham. That when Abraham is about to kill Isaac, God says, no, you completely misunderstood the test. The test was for you to say, no, I don't believe that you're the God, that this is the kind of God you are, that this is the relationship that you want. In other words, the test was for Abraham to be the kind of Abraham we see when he's told about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The Abraham who stands up for human values in the divine-human relationship instead of just getting steamrolled by God. And I love that commentary because it gives human beings a role in relation to God that is important. It's like, it's our job to bring what we know about being human to the relationship with God to help God be a better God. A God who's willing to follow standards of judgment before wiping out entire cities is a better God than a God who just arbitrarily wipes out everybody. From a human perspective, yes, but, that's... So the idea that Abraham failed that test, and that means the people who use traditional religions to justify violence, I think we can see that as them failing that test also. Because what they're doing is they're saying, well, if God wants me to do things that really don't even meet basic human standards of decency and morality, by golly, I guess I just have to do it. I think we're not only failing humanity, I think we're failing God also. The family pre-existed God's contact with Abraham by decades. Abraham and Sarah had been married and childless for a long time before God tells Abraham to go off somewhere. But when God talks to Abraham, the first thing he says is, a bit of a free translation here, violate your assigned role as a firstborn son and abandon your elderly father in a foreign country. And Abraham's like, okay, I'm going to do something that no child in this culture, no firstborn son in this culture is ever supposed to do. I'm going to do it for you. So the family, that's where the family's pattern of violating gender roles in relation to God as a result of the encounter with God comes from. And it looks to me like God sort of is using gender to stage these interventions. Patriarchal gender is such a powerful force that if God can mess that up, that's a way that God can become visible and a player in this family. So then Abraham and Sarah combine to violate gender norms with regard to Ishmael, right? And this is Sarah's idea. So that's also, to me, it looks not like what I imagine in a patriarchal society like that your wife says, you know what, exile your firstborn son and your concubine. In fact, just send him into the wilderness with not enough water or food. And Abraham's like, okay. And God says, yeah, do what Sarah says. So that also strikes me as a very strange innovation on patriarchal gender. So then you get Isaac, who's a firstborn son, who's not a firstborn son, but he's in the role of firstborn son. But instead of being a good thing at first, that targets him for murder. So that's another way that gender is being deformed by this radiation of God in the family. So yeah, Isaac has kids, and he has 2 kids, and he prefers, Isaac is not very masculine as near as we can tell, and he really prefers Esau. And Jacob hangs out with his mom and is his mother's favorite. So there is this gender binary, which I think also is exaggerated by the Torah, because the Torah, I think, is using this masculine feminine thing to emphasize the huge difference between being a firstborn and a secondborn, even though there's like a second of difference in their birth order. They're twins. They literally come out almost at the same moment. And so I feel like the Torah is using the male-female gender binary to magnify this, because as soon as Jacob leaves the house, there's no sign that he's particularly feminine, right? He rolls back the stone. He's, sleeping and having children all over the place. Anyway, he has 4 women that he's sleeping with and having children by. There's really no lack of testosterone in his portrayal. But nonetheless, the Torah wants us to think about these 2 sons as very different kinds of men. And I can't tell if Jacob is being presented as deviating, or the Torah is just saying, no, firstborns and secondborns, they really are different. And the secondborn's role is to be submissive to the firstborn. And so it's an analogy here. But for whatever reason, Jacob clearly sees himself as a firstborn who's trapped in a secondborn's body. And God sees him that way also, tells his mother before birth that it's going to be that way. And his mother goes along with this also. So Jacob really doesn't fit the gender role that he's assigned at birth. And he's always trying to subvert it and change it. And ultimately, he completely succeeds, but he doesn't succeed in subverting and taking over, like being a firstborn in a secondborn's body. He does that, but he doesn't do it in a way that enables him to stay in his family. Esau stays in the family orbit. Esau continues to fit that traditional idea of gender. But Jacob has to leave, and he never sees his parents again. And he has to subordinate himself to Esau in order to re-enter the family dynamic. So when Jacob has sons, he has tons and tons of sons. And he doesn't seem like a very hands-on father, except with regard to his youngest at that time, Joseph. He has another child, Benjamin, but we don't know very much about their relationship. So it's hard to tell, for me to tell. I know a lot of people see Joseph as Thomas Mann wrote 4 novels about Joseph as an effeminate gay man who's wildly successful. And there are trans readers of the Torah who say, yeah, he is clearly a trans, he has some kind of trans relation to his gender. To me, I mostly see him as a bratty, manipulative, brilliant younger child who, in this family system, all of the, if Jacob misses out on power in the family by seconds, Joseph is at the bottom of the patriarchal barrel by probably a couple of decades between, the first child. So many people would have to die for Joseph to become the first child. And but at the same time, he's the young one, and he's doted on, and he gets special favors, and he is brilliant and charismatic. So to me, it's hard to be clear how he reads in gender, but it is very clear that he gets expelled from the family gender dynamic. He doesn't fit very well in it, whether it's because he's too feminine or because of his own ambitions, which is kind of more where I see it. He very quickly runs afoul of the pecking order of the older brothers, and they sell him into slavery. And then he has to, he becomes, I think, the first Jew in exile, the first court Jew. There's no such thing as Jews. There's no Israelite nation, but he really becomes the template for that of you are existing among people who the Egyptians hated and looked down on everybody who wasn't Egyptian. They made everybody eat at separate tables. And Joseph, when his brothers show up, he makes them eat at a separate table. He eats at a separate table, and the Egyptians eat at a separate table from him. So it's clear he's kind of internalized the idea of hierarchy among ethnicities that the Egyptians have, even though he can't make it himself. But we see this again and again with assimilated, powerful Jews. And that role, as we know, like so many people have talked about, that has ways of deforming Jewish masculine gender. And it does for Joseph also. He's married and he has children, but he marries who Pharaoh tells him to marry. He doesn't have his own agency in terms of marriage. And he's the head of his household, sort of, but when his own family shows up and he reunites with them, he constantly has to get Pharaoh's permission. He has to make it clear to Pharaoh that he's not going to put his family ahead of Pharaoh's interests. So that, I think, is a pretty compromised view of masculinity in ways that have nothing to do with whether he likes to dress up in coats of many colors. And that feels to me like an anachronistic projection, by the way. I don't see anything, and the Torah doesn't mostly tell us what anybody wears. But it is clear that royalty would wear like purples and rare dyes and things like that. So I don't know that bright colors were coded feminine the way they are in 21st century American society.